This is Hubwonk. I'm Joe Selvaggi. Welcome to Hubwonk, a podcast of Pioneer Institute, a think tank in Boston. Do higher state taxes equate to better services and increased resident satisfaction? A new report from Cato Institute entitled Fiscal Policy Report Card on America's Governors 2022 seeks to answer that question. In the biannual survey of state governors' leadership on tax policy across all 50 states, the data compares the revenue each state collects to the quality of services provided to see if a positive correlation exists between higher taxes and better services. Indeed, this question mirrors one Massachusetts voters must consider on November 8th with ballot question 1, which imposes an income surtax on high earners with the promise that more revenue will equate to better public education and transportation. Were such higher state taxes correlated with higher resident satisfaction, the case for a tax increase would be on solid footing. If instead, states with higher tax rates compared less favorably and higher state tax rates offered no relative benefit, indeed, if the strong net out migration from high tax states is taken to be a measure of resident dissatisfaction, then the argument for higher state tax rates loses its foundation. My guest today is Chris Edwards, the Kiltz Family Chair in Fiscal Studies at Cato Institute and a top expert on federal and state tax and budget issues. Mr. Edwards is co-author of the Cato's State Governor's Report Card and has researched and written extensively on states' comparative fiscal health and performance. Chris will share with us the observations of his paper, including giving a report card grade to our outgoing Governor Baker, and offer his insight into ways residents can vote to reshape their tax regime to deliver a more transparent and valuable state government that attracts new residents and cultivates a prosperous economy. When I return, I'll be joined by Cato Institute's Chris Edwards. Okay, we're back. This is Hubwonk. I'm Joe Selvaggi, and I'm now pleased to be joined by economist and chair of fiscal studies at Cato Institute, Chris Edwards. Welcome to Hubwonk, Chris.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me, Joe.
Okay, Chris, I'm excited about today's conversation about your ratings of 50 state governors. But before we dive into our topic, give our listeners a sense of how you became an expert in state fiscal policy, particularly in relative rankings of state fiscal policy.
I actually started in examining state and local budget policies 30 years ago at a tax foundation in Washington, D.C. here. And then I spent a number of years at Price Waterhouse dealing with corporate tax issues. I went up to Capitol Hill, dealt with federal tax issues, and the last 2 decades have been at Cato dealing with federal, state, and local fiscal issues. So I'm pretty well-rounded in dealing with tax and spending issues.
Absolutely, you've earned your stripes. So I think our conversation is particularly relevant because we have an election coming up. So I enjoyed reading your recently released project about rating all 50 states, or effectively all 50 governors. We here in Massachusetts will soon, on election day, less than a week after this will be released, we'll be choosing a new legislator, a new governor for sure. We also have a ballot measure, question 1, it's on the ballot, asking voters to decide whether we'll have a surtax on on the income of high earners. What I liked about your report is it reminds us here in the Bay State that we are not the only state in the union, but we compete with other states for the best and the brightest, the people, the companies, the industries that make us prosperous. Your report does a good job of comparing them to each other. What was your goal in creating this report that rates all 50 states?
Well, Cato's been doing our report every 2 years for quite a while. We look at the tax and spending records of the nation's governors. It has struck me often that governors and legislatures that spend a lot of money often get kudos from the mainstream media. And I thought, you know what, it makes sense to actually give a pat on the back to governors who have tried their best to run a lean government, to let the citizens keep as much money, keep as much of their own tax money as they can. So our report card, it's based on sort of hard data, but we give the highest grades to the governors who have restrained spending the most, cut taxes, and it gives the lowest grades to the governors who have increased taxes and spending the most. And there is a pretty dramatic difference between the best governors and the worst governors from our point of view in the nation.
As they say, we're all 50 laboratories of democracy and coming up with our policies that are best for our populations. But why? I mean, that's a fairly normative statement. Is there, other than folks don't like taxes, or some folks do like taxes and spending, why do you see a benefit to fiscal restraint for an individual state?
Well, one thing that really strikes me in studying the 50 states is that there's no obvious advantage in having bigger government. If you take the biggest government state, New York, and you compare it to some of the smallest government states like Florida and or South Dakota or New Hampshire, New Yorkers pay a heck of a lot more in taxes, and they don't get better services. It's hard to define the quality of services, but for example, in New York, the tax burden as a share of income is twice as big as the tax burden as a share of income in Florida, which is remarkable. But if you look, for example, at the quality of K-12 schools, Florida schools on most of the state comparisons are actually better than New York schools. If you look at the level of bureaucracy in New York versus Florida, you can go to the Census Bureau and you can see this information directly. New York, for example, they have 31% more bureaucrats in their K-12 schools. They've got twice as many people in solid waste or garbage collection as Florida. Their welfare bureaucracy has 3 times as many employees as Florida. Their highway system in New York has twice as many employees as the highway system in Florida. It's remarkable. So these differences are really big and dramatic. I mean, in my view, residents of states like New York, frankly, are being ripped off by their governments. And I really wish that more residents of New York would sort of awaken to the idea that they're paying a lot more and they're really not getting their value for money in terms of government services.
So you gave us a lot to unpack there. So let's dilate a little bit and pull back. I liked a particularly provocative piece you wrote recently, pointing out that actually, in fact, 11 of our 50 states don't even have income taxes at all. I think those of us here in Massachusetts assume it's what the rate will be, not whether it will exist. Share with our listeners why or how is it that 11 states somehow managed to not tax the income of their residents?
So actually, there's 9 states now that don't have individual income taxes. 2 of them are sort of exceptional states, Wyoming and Alaska, because they have a lot of energy industry related revenues. So if you put those 2 states aside, there are 7 states, Florida, Texas, Wyoming, New Hampshire, South Dakota, Tennessee, may have missed one or 2 there. They don't have individual income taxes, and their overall size of government is smaller than the other 40 or so states. They run a leaner government. In studying those states and reading many news articles about the state budgeting in those states, I do not find any kind of outcry for bigger government. Those states run a leaner government. They generally have a very good school systems. They have good highway systems. They provide all the basic services that some of the bigger government states provide, but at a lower cost. They're more efficient. If you look, for example, at there's been studies on how much it costs each of the states to build a mile of interstate highway. The differences between the states are pretty dramatic. So I think we can learn a lot by comparing the states and comparing the efficiency with which government works.
So we, in that list of no tax states, is one just to our north, less than an hour drive from here in Boston, New Hampshire. Governor Sununu, I think, got an A on your report. How does a state with no income tax pay its bills? It's, as you say, it's leaner, it's meaner, but it must get money for roads somewhere. So how does a state with no income tax function?
Well, the states generally, and I looked at the data recently in a Cato article, and the states that have no individual income taxes do tend to have somewhat higher sales taxes and property taxes. However, their overall size of government is lower. So it's a combination of some of the other taxes are a little higher, but overall they run a leaner government. New Hampshire actually has 2 substantial business taxes, which I don't think is a good idea, but that's how they partly fund their government, and they have substantial property taxes in New Hampshire. New Hampshire, as your viewers in Massachusetts, I'm sure know, has a really interesting state and local government, much different than other states where they have a very decentralized power. In Massachusetts, the local governments have a lot more sort of fiscal power than state level governments. And I think that's a good idea as well. I think government closer to the people tends to work more efficiently. Citizens can keep better tab on it. And one other thing I would say, generally about, I think eliminating a major tax base like the individual income tax and relying on, say, just a general sales tax like South Dakota does, makes a lot of sense in terms of the citizens being able to understand how much their government costs and understanding their relationship with the government. So if you don't have an individual income tax, but you save a statewide sales tax at, say, 7%, the citizen knows that the state government costs about 7%. And that's useful information. Governments like to have as many complicated tax bases as they can to try to, hit citizens from every side in terms of raising revenue. But from the citizen's perspective, that's not a good idea. From the citizen's perspective, you want the state government to have a single, simple, sort of flat rate tax that hits everyone equally. So there's sort of taxpayer solidarity. And so the citizens can understand the basic cost of government.
Indeed. And if it's a sales tax, it's hitting you every time you make a purchase rather than on one day of the year, April 15th, when we all don't enjoy filling out our tax form. So I think that would be fair. Just to put an even finer point on it, we're making generalizations about the states with no income tax. In general, I don't want to put words in your mouth, those states in general also have more lean, mean, efficient government. So there's a direct correlation between an income tax and the size of that state's government.
Oh, that's absolutely right. And you raised the issue of Massachusetts, and you're facing this referenda, or a ballot question this November. One thing I would point out, if you look at the data on Massachusetts is kind of an average sized government compared to the other 50 states. It's certainly not one of the most lean governments, but it's also substantially smaller than, say, New York government. So you're kind of in the middle. Even though the politics in Massachusetts have kind of trended to the left to some extent over the decades, I think that Massachusetts flat rate individual income tax is one thing that has kind of helped anchor the state and kept the government from becoming too big. You'll find states like California where they have these highly progressive graduated individual income taxes. They raise an enormous amount of money from the very highest group of citizens. So in California, the top 1% pay 50% of all income taxes. I don't think that's a good way to run your government. I think that the burden of state governments ought to be sort of fairly shared and proportional across the citizens. Having a flat rate tax, I think makes a lot of sense. If you have a highly proportional tax, I think a state like Massachusetts is going to scare away a lot of its high earning and more entrepreneurial residents, which ultimately hurts everyone in the state. And that's something you find in the data. And, we can talk about that in terms of, if you look at the interstate migration data, it is clear that Americans, and especially high income Americans, are moving from the highest tax states, especially the ones that have high income tax rates, to lower tax states and the states that don't have income taxes. That's pretty clear in the data. So that's a risk that Massachusetts would run if they raise their top income tax rate.
So I want to get back to that theme, this notion that states compete for high income or let's say high tax paying individuals. In general, you do this report every 2 years. What have been the trends recently? Have states in general been raising taxes, or have states in general become lower taxes, or again to use the cliche, leaner and meaner? What have they been doing, and why do you think they're doing what they're doing?
So as the nation pulled out of COVID over 2 years ago, now something really surprising happened, which was state budget surpluses started rising across the country. In the last 2 years, we've seen huge state budget surpluses. That has led about 20 states to enact major tax reforms to use the surpluses to take advantage of that and pass major income tax reforms, lowering income tax rates. So that's been the main trend. I think that's been a fantastic trend. The smart governors and the smart legislatures, in my view, understand that there's states like Florida that are big draws for interstate migration, and they're responding to that in sensible ways by trying to make their state tax system more attractive. So that's been the main trend the last couple decades. And in our Cato Governor's Report Card, I look in detail at state interstate migration data. The IRS actually tracks very closely where people move to every year. About 3% of US households move to a different state every year. And if you look at the data in detail, it is clear that people are moving from the higher tax to lower tax states. So for example, if you look at the 25 lowest tax states in the United States, 20 of them have net in-migration. Of those 9 no income tax states we talked about, 8 of them have net in-migration. If you look at the IRS data breaks it down people by income level, the highest income people have an even stronger propensity to move to the lower tax states and out of the high tax states. So one data point on that, for example, New York State has been draining residents to other states for decades now. New York loses 2 residents in out-migration every year for each 1 resident moving into New York State. But the highest income group in New York, they are losing 3 residents for each one moving in. And the biggest flow of people in America is from New York to Florida. Some people will say, well, people are just moving south to places like Florida because it's warmer and sunnier. But actually, the data shows that clearly isn't true either, because New Hampshire has been a consistent and steady draw for in-migration over the decades. So has South Dakota, which has no income tax and one of the lowest tax burdens in the country. South Dakota has been a consistent in-migration draw, and yet nearly all of its neighbors, if you look on a map, have a consistent out-migration. So it is clear that people are moving to lower tax states. It's not the only reason why, of course, why people move to other states, but I think it is an important factor to consider. And I think especially, and a last point on this, especially for the cold northern states like Massachusetts, Illinois that are losing residents, you've got to be extra. You've got to have an extra efficient and lean government if you want to retain your citizens in the cold northern states, because there is this natural draw for people to move south. So states like New York and Massachusetts have to have better, more efficient governments than states like Florida if they wish to keep their citizens, and especially their most productive and entrepreneurial citizens, if they want to retain those citizens and so that they don't move out and move to some of the faster growing states.
Is this an immediate effect? Meaning, so we look at, let's say, state tax rates, they go up, they go down. Effectively, I'm assuming, though I don't know, when states in these most recent times have generally trended towards reducing their tax rates, has it had the intended effect? And then the flip side is when certain states, let's say California or Connecticut or New York, when they do impose taxes on high earners, does it indeed encourage not just people to leave, but those high earners to leave? The people they're trying to tax, are they the ones who respond most quickly? Or I guess you would call it elasticity of immigration.
Well, you can approach this 2 ways. You can look at the data, and it seems to me just the raw data is pretty clear. But then the other thing that's obvious, I've been following news stories on these issues for many years, and it is clear when you get a high earner like Elon Musk, for example, recently moved and moved his company and moved his charitable activities from California to Texas because he got sick and tired of the high taxes and regulations in California. Often, especially those high earning entrepreneurs will say, in public statements, they got sick and tired of the high taxes in New York or Illinois or wherever, and that's why they're moving to Florida. So often, these anecdotes are pretty clear, and wealthy people in particular will often mention that this is a real factor. I think this is something that high tax states and northern states need to really think about is when high tax states lose someone who's very entrepreneurial like Elon Musk, the states lose that person's income. Of course, they often lose the person's business activities. Elon Musk is moving most of his operations to Texas. The stories on Elon Musk suggest that he's also moving his charitable activities to Texas. So you'll find if you look at philanthropy data that wealthy people will often give a lot of money to charitable activities within their state. So, Phil Knight of Nike Shoe, for example, has given hundreds of millions of dollars to charities within Oregon over the last couple of decades. So when a wealthy person moves to a lower tax state, they'll often move a lot of their philanthropy activities to their new home state. There's the issue of venture capital and angel investment. Wealthy people are very important, not just because they start companies, but because they fund startup companies. And so the reason why Silicon Valley is sort of a cluster, or one of the reasons, is because wealthy people like to fund startups that are close to them in physical proximity, so they can keep tabs on these entrepreneurs they're funding. And I've looked into this in a study in detail at Cato. So when a wealthy person moves from a state like New York to Florida, there's going to be a tendency for them to start funding startup businesses in their new home state. So the bottom line here, I think, is that when high tax states scare out some of their high earning and productive citizens, they lose the income, they lose the entrepreneurial activities, they lose some of the philanthropic activities, and they lose some of the investment in startup businesses. So states lose a lot when they lose high earning citizens.
So for our listeners who are regard high earners, perhaps they may think good riddance. I don't need a bunch of rich people here. When we intentionally discourage them from staying, the danger is they take with them everything that goes along with their life, which is their charitable giving, their spending on all the services, but of course the jobs they may create, which may be quite a few people who are average income earners. That also goes as they migrate outward.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So I want to zoom in on, we have 50 states, but our listeners, most are situated here in Massachusetts. I noticed, though, we have, I think, the most popular governor in the nation with Charlie Baker, and he's a Republican. Your rating system gave him merely a C. So how do we reconcile a average rating with a popular government? Is there a disconnect between your scoring and voters' satisfaction with their elected leader?
So it's interesting, Joe. I actually looked at the popularity data and compared to the scores they got on the Cato Governor's Report Card. And I actually don't see too much of a correlation. You're right. I think the governor of Massachusetts has been one of the most popular in the nation in the last few years, but also Chris Sununu in next door New Hampshire, who's been one of the most sort of libertarian small government governors for many years now, who scored at the top of the Cato report. He has also been one of the most popular governors in the nation. I will say that I think at the far end of the spectrum, some of the governors who scored the worst, I mean, a good example is the governor of Oregon. She's generally has been one of the most unpopular governors in the nation. She's pushed to raise taxes every year consistently. So I think if you have a governor that consistently pushes to hike taxes on average people year after year, gas tax hikes and cigarette tax hikes and sales tax hikes, they will be very unpopular. But I think governors like the governor of Massachusetts, who are kind of, they raise some taxes, they cut some other taxes. I think it's maybe harder for people to figure out what the sort of the bottom line is. And the governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan, is another interesting example. He's very much a centrist. He's been one of the most popular governors in the nation as a Republican in a Democratic state. He's vetoed tax hike after tax hike, which may have led to his popularity. But on the other hand, he spent a lot of money. which, on my scoring wouldn't be great. But he has resisted hiking taxes, so it's a complicated stew here. And of course, taxes and spending are only part of the story about governor popularity.
So our popular Governor Baker is leaving office, and we're going to get a new governor. We've mentioned a couple times here, we have a ballot initiative to create a surtax on high earners. I'm assuming if that were to pass, Massachusetts would get even a lower score than a C in the future. Is that fair to assume?
Well, the Cato report just looks at the last 3 years of a governor's activities. So whoever if this is citizen initiative and Baker's not responsible, I guess it wouldn't be in the Cato scoring. But there are other reports, one by the Tax Foundation that puts out a report every year on state business competitiveness, how good states are in attracting entrepreneurs and businesses. And I would note that on that report, the Massachusetts actually does very poorly. I think Massachusetts is about 38th. And the thing about the individual income tax is most American businesses are actually not structured as corporations paying the corporate income tax. They're structured as partnerships, sole proprietorships, LLCs and S corporations that pay the individual income tax. So in Massachusetts, if it is to raise its top individual income tax, it actually is going to hit tens or hundreds of thousands of businesses in the state, which would be very bad for the economy. And there is no doubt, we talked about how responsive individuals are moving from higher tax to lower tax states. There is no doubt that businesses do enormous amount of research and due diligence when they want to set up new factories and research facilities, and they figuring out which state to set up their new facilities. I think that there would be, you raise the top individual income tax rate in Massachusetts, young entrepreneurs, I think, would think twice about starting a business in the state. They can move next door to New Hampshire and not pay an individual income tax. So I think so the issue is not just sort of hitting rich people, it is hitting business activity, and you would risk driving business activity out of the state.
Okay, well, again, we've had other guests on the show who have echoed your observation or your speculation that it would have, in the long run, a really detrimental effect on the state were we to pass such a tax. But what would you say, again, I can imagine some of our listeners hearing this and saying, higher taxes and spending is bad, lower taxes and lower spending is good. What would you say to those who say this is just simply a race to the bottom? Meaning, if every state's going to compete against every other state for zero tax, low cost, won't our schools crumble and our bridges fall down? What would you say to those who say this is all just a formula for a race to the bottom?
So the first thing, I hope there is a race to the bottom in terms of income taxes. I don't think states need income taxes, and as we just discussed, there are 9 states that run their states quite well. Some of the best run states in the country don't have income taxes. So I don't think I don't think state governments need income taxes. The way I think about it is, the federal government has a very large income tax. The state governments, can run their activities mainly with sales taxes, and then local governments can be funded mainly with property taxes. I actually think that would be a good system. Citizens could they would better understand which levels of government are responsible for which taxes. So I hope there is a race to the bottom in income taxes. I don't see any, as we sort of touched on, I don't see any strong relationship between the quality of services and providing citizens the services they need and tax levels. Like I said, I think the states, the very highest tax states like New York, I think the residents are being ripped off, frankly. They are not getting quality services. Cato does another report called Freedom in the 50 State, where we look at individual freedoms in terms of economic freedom and social freedoms. New York is the least free state in the nation. And it has a very high cost government. So New Yorkers are paying more and they're getting less freedom. I don't think that's a good deal at all. So I would be happy if there was a race to the bottom in terms of eliminating individual income taxes at the state level.
Which would be good news for almost everyone except, let's say, current and prospective bureaucrats. So we're getting close to the end of our time together. I'd like to ask always towards the end, sort of the king for the day kind of question. Now, I'll give you two ways to answer this. Either if you were the governor of the 51st state, let's call it Imaginaria, and you have, let's say, broad legislative authority and influence, what would your state policy look like as far as tax revenue goes? What rate would it be and how would it be collected? Or if instead you want to answer, which state do you think most closely models an ideal level of government or governance? Which governor do you think is doing it just about right?
Yeah, I think a couple really good models are South Dakota and New Hampshire. Most of the revenue comes from the sales tax. I love New Hampshire because of its decentralized governmental structure. The government is closer to the people. I think that the single easiest and best reform for any state to make would be to repeal their corporate income tax. States absolutely do not need corporate income taxes. The corporate tax burden ultimately just lands on individuals in the form of a lower pay for workers or lower returns for shareholders or higher prices for consumers. So corporate taxes are really just a shell covering up the cost of government that lands on individuals, and they're damaging. And as I mentioned, there is no doubt that businesses do enormous research when they're opening new factories and facilities about where to locate. States, every citizen should want their state to be able to attract businesses, to create jobs and opportunity and income for individuals. I think corporate income taxes are really damaging, and actually they do a lot of damage even though they hardly raise any money. So state corporate income taxes only raise about 3% of state revenues, and yet they do all this damage. So I think that is the number one reform, I think, for state governments would be to repeal their corporate income taxes.
Wonderful. Well, you're singing our song here. I think, again, we've made the point that corporations don't pay taxes. People do, either workers or consumers. So it is an illusion to think we can collect from an imaginary legal construct. So again, I appreciate you pointing that out. Well, Chris, this has been very informative. Where can our listeners find more about your writing, your research, or this very interesting report rating all of the governors to see where we fit and why?
Well, I'm easy to find at cato.org, Cato Institute, or you can just Google my name, Chris Edwards, and you'll find all my recent writing on state and local government fiscal policy. Thanks a lot for having me, Joe.
Well, I enjoy it. Thank you very much for being on the show, Chris. This has been another episode of Hubwonk, a podcast of Pioneer Institute. If you enjoyed today's episode, there are several ways to support Hubwonk and Pioneer Institute. It would be easier for you and better for us if you subscribe to Hubwonk on your iTunes podcatcher. If you'd like to help make it easier for others to find Hubwonk, it would be great if you offer a 5-star rating or a favorable review. We're always grateful if you want to share Hubwonk with friends. If you have ideas or comments or suggestions for me about future episode topics, you're welcome to email me at hubwonk@pioneerinstitute.org. Please join me next week for a new episode of Hubwonk.